My name is Father John Valadez. I am the priest and pastor at St. Timothy, Antiochian Orthodox Church in Lompoc, California. Little town on the central coast, surrounded by farmland and away from the big cities. I was not born or raised Orthodox or raised Christian really in any sense. I do remember as a kid my mom going to various Protestant denominations, but nothing was stable, nothing was really ingrained in me as far as that goes. I found Christianity when I was late in middle school, and just through friends and things like that. And later in high school, got involved with things a little more deeply. I really got sucked into a punk scene. I grew up in Orange County, California, and music became an outlet for me in many ways in my teenage years. I guess I was just kind of sick with the plastic culture that I saw around me and the materialism that wasn't fulfilling. And so I got sucked into all of that stuff, but what saved me out of it was a Protestant punk scene in Southern California, and these people had a great community. We met, and there was concerts every weekend. It was kind of my real church outside of a church that I was going to on Sundays, because they preached what I thought was a radical gospel, a gospel that was not of this world, and a Christianity with some asceticism and things like that. And so we had spiked hair and leather jackets and mosh pits and all these kinds of things. But then at the end of the concert, there'd be acoustic guitars and praise band worship, the typical kind of Protestant evangelical worship and sermon and things like that. So that really drew me into Christianity, I think, the most, and really solidified my faith in Christ the most. And but there came a time where a lot of these bands and other things started to break up, move other places, and we didn't really have these meetings anymore. And so one of the places that became the meeting spot was a tattoo parlor called Goodfellas in Orange, California, and it was we had a Bible study there. So after the tattoo machines stopped buzzing and things like this, we met. We called it Monday nights. It was at 11 p.m. or so, Monday night, when the tattoo shop shut down, and we had this Bible study. And the leader of the study, many people know now, is Father Turbo Qualls. And he became Orthodox through his own story and journey with his family, and told us about Orthodoxy, who were in the Bible study. And a good amount of us ended up coming to the church. 30 of us were baptized together one year, and then the next year another 30, and some more after that. But the monastery in Northern California, St. Herman of Alaska Monastery, started by Father Seraphim Rose. In the 90s, they put together a magazine called Death to the World. It was a reach out to people who were in punk and rock movements to try to expose the lives of the Desert Fathers and various Orthodox articles and wisdom and lives of saints to people who were really engulfed in this punk rock aesthetic, And so the zine or magazine had all of that aesthetic kind of in it, skulls, but there were ossuaries, pictures of ossuaries of monasteries and things like this. And so the monastery in Northern California that started this, the abbot at the time, who's now a bishop, Bishop Gerasim of Dallas-Fort Worth, when he was the abbot there, he sent us a huge box full of these magazines, and we started reading them and really getting sucked into them, and it really drew us into the church. And we found out later that a lot of these magazines had inspired the bands that we were really kind of involved with and everything in the 90s prior to us finding Orthodoxy. So it was kind of like Death to the World was with me the entire time, or Orthodoxy was with me the entire time. I just didn't really know it. And so a lot of the things that I loved about this Protestant punk scene were actually Orthodox. Wasn't really exposed to Orthodoxy because maybe people were scared that it was too Catholic or something like that. But yeah, that's how I came into the church, through these Death to the World magazines, through a Bible study at a tattoo shop, and discovering the ancient church that way.
I think it's interesting because the punk scene, the tattoo scene is really, I guess you could call it counterculture. Yeah. And in today's world, we're seeing the reverse. And now being Christian is the counterculture. I don't know if that's something you've picked up on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And some of the big name punk rockers like John Lydon, who started the band the Sex Pistols, the big, the beginning of punk rock and things like this. He's even come out in the last few years, like against vaccines and against this and against the totalitarian kind of culture and all these kinds of things. So it's kind of funny that although it seems like it's been accepted as the norm, these guys that started a long time ago are starting to realize, like, hey, maybe what we are doing has not produced the greatest fruit, Death to the World is a name that the monks picked in the 90s when they started the magazine as kind of a fish hook. On the inside of the magazine, the first page, you usually find, what do we mean by death to the world? And it's a quote from St. Isaac of Syria. And he says, by the world we mean the passions. And he lists off all the different passions. And he says, see for which of these passions you are alive and which ones you're dead to, then you'll know how far you're dead to the world, how far you're alive to the world. But this title on the front, Death to the World, it helped as a fish hook to people who are either not Christian or opposed to anything that would look like religious or look like any kind of Christian slogan, right? And it gets them to open up the magazine and start to read a little bit deeper about Christ and about his church and about the lives of the saints, which they might not if it was something that was catchy, more Christian or, glossy name or something like this, Our call as Christians is to live ascetically, whether we are in a monastery or whether we are in the world. St. John Chrysostom says that the difference between a married man and a monk is that a married man has a wife. That's the difference. And so all Christians are called to asceticism. And what does asceticism mean? Asceticism basically means to begin to fight to acquire the virtues. And to acquiring the virtues, just like with any great treasure, just like with any great thing, it has to be accomplished through a lot of sweat and toil, We don't win trophies or become NFL players or whatever just by running on the field. The body has to go through some kind of crucifixion, in order to achieve something. And it's the same thing in the spiritual life. There has to be crucifixion of the passions, of all of the sins that have sickened us. And in order for us to be healed, there has to be a fight against those diseases that plague our soul. And so a Christian in the world is called to live ascetically, to disdain the things of this world that cause spiritual sickness. And what does it mean to be spiritually sick? It means to be spiritually blind in many ways, and callous to our relationship with Christ. If we're sick, our heart is not able to communicate with God the way that it is supposed to. Spiritually sick, I mean. And so the body has to go, or the whole person has to go through a process of healing in order for that communion to be restored. And asceticism is the way to do that. I was reading something this morning by Irandisa Macrina, who's a wonderful new holy woman, and she talked about putting on every morning the armor of God and the helmet being the helmet of humility, because without humility, the spiritual life isn't, or at least our struggle isn't worth anything. If we don't have humility when we fast, if we don't have humility when we pray, if we don't have humility when we go to services, then it's not worth it, That is the pinnacle of virtue, because it is the life of Christ. To be truly human means to become like Christ, because the new Adam is the perfect man, and his path is a path of humility. And if we go through the spiritual life proud, or think that we're exalted or doing better than those around us, or constantly judging us, then we've entirely missed the point. When you look at Christ, we see that he's spit on, we see that he is crucified, we see that he is mocked, and he lives a life of complete humility before the cross, before his persecutors. And so Christians, if our Master has endured this path of humility, Christians are called to be truly humble, and not in a vainglorious sense where sometimes we can be tempted or deceived that we're truly humble people, but at the same time we're plagued with all sorts of judgments about others, and almost can think that we're prideful in our humility. St. John Climacus says that vainglory can be everywhere. We can put on a suit, a really nice clothes and stuff, and be boastful and proud, and this can be vainglorious. He said we can also put on rags and say, oh, we're so humble, we're the least, etc., etc. But still, at the same time, the heart can be proud, be full of vainglory. And so there is a straight and narrow path of humility, and humility is given to us through spiritual exercises. And there's easy spiritual exercises that one can do, though they can be painful, to just practice in everyday life to acquire humility. And a lot of the fathers talk about silence being one of them, that when we're so full of opinions, especially today, and our opinions can be just posted everywhere and broadcasted everywhere, and we think a lot of ourselves these days. And if we're silent in the face of even someone who may be wrong, we have a temptation to make our point, or to argue, or to prove them wrong, or whatever it may be. If we practice silence before that kind of a thing, if we crucify our ego before people in situations like that, then we gain a little bit of humility. When we're obedient to our spiritual father, we're obedient to the canons of the church, we gain humility, because it's all subjecting our own ego to put it in submission to something else, whether that's to our neighbor, whether that's to the church, whether that's to our spiritual father. And it helps us to cure the want to always be self-sufficient, right? And have the ego just completely dominate our words, our actions, and how we think about and carry out our everyday life.
How do we make the distinction between self-hatred and humility? I think one of the criticisms that people like to make is that they see the example of humility, they hear you talking about humility, and they're like, well, what am I supposed to do? Just let people pick on me or walk all over me?
The fathers say that the whole passion of despondency and self-loathing is a sin in itself as well, because it is bound up with our ego and our pride, because we think so highly of ourselves that we should be at a place where we're not yet, So there can be a problem with thinking that in the pursuit of humility that people fall into despondency and despair and things like that. But that's actually, it's another spiritual sickness. It's another spiritual sickness that the devil uses to plague people so they don't progress more on a spiritual path. And we heal those things through our confessor, through being with the spiritual father, through the various medicines of the church, so that those things begin to be healed and mended. But it's really bound up with our own ego when we fall into those kinds of sins. Even though it seems like it's totally the opposite, it's still a expectation that we have about ourselves that needs to be let go of, that needs to be crucified, if you will. The saints teach us how to live out Christ's life in every age. And that's why it's so extremely important, because they're God bearers. That is, they bear him. They bear his image to the world. And Saint Anthony in Egypt, he lived out a certain life of asceticism. Same with Saint Maximus, Saint John Chrysostom, Saint Basil, in early centuries of Christianity. Then we have later ascetics, and all the way up until today, like Saint Paisios, and Saint Porphyrios, and Saint Iacobos of Evia, and these wonderful modern ascetics. And we see that throughout all of their lives, they're the same. They have the same God-bearing quality, but they're carried out in a different age. And so Saint Paisios, for instance, experienced some of the modernity that we experience today, but yet is able to bear God, right, during the time that he lived. And so it gives us an example of how to become God-bearers in our own age that we live in, because there's a temptation that because we have all of this sin around us, because we have all this evil around us, because the world is going into a place of darkness, and sometimes we focus too much on what is happening around us, that there's a temptation that, how can one become like a saint, in this kind of age? But when we look around us, we do see that saints continue to exist even in our own day, So they are very important to us because they give us a model, and they emulate, and they give us hope that we can become God-bearers even today. And Saint Paisios is, famous for his wonderful little simple ways of explaining the spiritual life. And with the saints, he and the spiritual life, he talked about how we have to be tuned in. The radio dial has to be tuned into the right station in order to receive grace, right? And the saints have tuned in to that station, and they give us a point to go to. They've blazed through this trail for us to be able to follow in order to emulate Christ all the more. And so that is why they are so incredibly important to us, because they bear Christ to us even in this age, not as an ideology either, or Christ as a historical figure, but Christ that is experienced deep within the heart of someone, where he is truly seated and enthroned in their life and in their movements and in their speech and in the way that they serve him, everything. And so Christ doesn't become just somebody of the past or somebody way up in the sky, but in those people who even live out in a modern secular world, he becomes someone who is incredibly experienced and someone who gives life to his servants.
Do you have any particular saints that stand out to you?
Yeah. Saint Nicephorus the leper is a wonderful saint that has intervened in the life of our parish here and in my life, my family's life, quite a bit. Saint Paisios, I think so many people, especially today, love him so much. And Saint John Maximovich, who's my patron saint and very close to this area. And there's saints of California whom I love very much. Saint John, Saint Sebastian of California, Saint Peter the Aleut, the martyr, and some who are not canonized, like Father Seraphim Rose, whom I love very much and are big inspirations, especially for our local, California is sometimes looked at as like the liberal, crazy state, but we have 4 saints of this state. So patron saints are great because they are someone that we form a relationship with, like a close friend, and are powerful intercessors for our lives. And when we come to the church, usually if we have a Christian name, sometimes the priest will have us keep that name and keep whatever saint it is. If somebody's named Jeremiah or something like that, maybe give them Jeremiah the prophet or other saints that have Christian names. And but there's also a tradition of taking an entirely new name, especially if one feels drawn to the saint. There's a popular saying that your patron saint will pick you, you don't pick them, and I find that to be very true, because even when somebody picks someone, maybe for even a different reason, later on they find out that there's all these similarities between, maybe they didn't know before, between their life and this saint's life, and we see that happen over and over with people, just these holy coincidences, if you will. And so it's a process of prayer, it's a process of discernment from a spiritual father or the priest that's catechizing. And usually we read a lot of the lives of the saints, and so we become familiar with their lives and become familiar with who they are, where they come from, how they carried out their life, what kind of characteristics they have. And that's another beautiful thing, is that when holy people go on this path and become holy people, God doesn't destroy their personality, They're saved in their location, they're saved in the kind of personality they have, in the family background they have, et cetera, et cetera. And so people might be drawn to them because they have those similarities as well, and can see that, oh, I had this broken life before, I had this life before, like Saint Mary of Egypt. Look, she became a saint. I can become a saint too, Oh, there's this saint that lived in this part of the world, and I live close to it too. Wow. Like St. John of San Francisco, he walked the streets of San Francisco. He became a saint in San Francisco, which is like a notoriously, corrupt city. And so a saint can become a saint anywhere, and in any family history and in any background, right? It's just that they have the will to do it. And so picking this saint and taking on their name is an inspiration for a person to tread along that path with them and kind of have a guide along that path to inspire them.